Nürburgring's 14-mile configuration is dangerous. Racing in the wet is also dangerous. Combine the two and you've pretty much got one big game of Russian roulette, or to give it its proper medical term, the 1968 German Grand Prix. The Nürburgring needs no introduction. It is, after all, the only track on the planet. If it's not the Nürburgring, then people aren't interested. It's the racing version of, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going. It's a track that once tested man and machine. Now it ruins cars because saying we did this time on the Nürburgring is used for just pure marketing. James May was right. And that's not to say it's not a fun track. I'll drive a few laps here and there for banter and a Lotus Elise on a Assetto Corsa from time to time, but once upon a time there were full-on F1 races happening here, and the drivers were terrified of the place because it was either go down the side of a hill on fire and die, or hit a piece of the scenery, burst into flames, and die. And in 1968, Formula 1 had now become fully invested in the whole safety thing. Jim Clark, regarded as being the greatest racing driver of all time, well, I mean, in my opinion, he's the greatest racing driver of all time, was killed in a Formula 2 race at Hockenheim in the April of 1968, and the sport had had one massive wake-up call. Jim Clark was too good to die in a racing car. Jim Clark died in a racing car. Now people were starting to take it very seriously. 4 Formula 1 drivers had already been killed in the months leading up to the German Grand Prix. Clark at Hockenheim in April, Mike Spence at the Indy 500, Joe Schlesser at the French Grand Prix, which is a video for another day, and Ludovico Scarfiotti at a hill climb event. So what the drivers were doing were just pushing and pushing and pushing. They wanted seatbelts to be mandatory, and even Jackie Stewart said that at the beginning he found them uncomfortable because he's of an era where cars didn't have seatbelts. For people like you or me, it's probably the opposite. You take your seatbelt off while the car's still moving, and it feels weird. And drivers at that time liked to take a punt on being ejected from the car and breaking a few bones, as opposed to being trapped in the car and burning to death. It was a weird paradox in a way. The drivers were fearing for their safety, but still they carried on racing. Jean-Pierre Beltoise once said that it's not bravery going at full speed, it's technical precision, the desire to do better than the previous lap. That's all racing is. And in the documentary Grand Prix The Killer Years, which was a BBC documentary that I highly recommend you watch if you can find it, Jackie Stewart said that he had to remove all emotion from the equation if he was going to go out there and drive on these tracks that were, for want of a better phrase, death traps. Spa and the Nürburgring were a test of the driver's ability, not just with the machinery that they were driving, but also testing their mental strength. Trees, embankments, sheer drops, no room for error. One mistake and that's it. It's RNG whether you woke up on a hospital bed or never woke up at all. There was that feeling of we need to test the stones of the blokes driving as well as the performance of the cars. The tracks were set up in such a way that the driver could see where he'd end up if he lost it. There were no barriers. You were lucky to have straw bales which easily caught fire on hot exhausts. The GPDA had already boycotted the Belgian Grand Prix because Spa wouldn't see the bigger picture. Stewart and his mates were saying that it wasn't just about the drivers, it was about spectators as well. It was the responsibility of the track to adapt to the cars, not the other way around. And the Spa circuit owners were arrogant enough that they'd never boycott the Belgian Grand Prix. But they did. So it makes it some sort of a miracle and maybe borderline hypocrisy that they went to the Nürburgring at all, because the Nürburgring was just as dangerous as its Belgian counterpart, and like Spa, it had problems with the weather. The Nürburgring is in the middle of the Eifel Mountains. Rain lingers. Fog can happen because it's so high up. The Nürburgring, Spa and Hockenheim all suffered from weather that any other track would be a mild inconvenience. Here, it made everybody miserable, and all anyone wanted to do was get it done and go home. Rain anywhere else is a challenge. At these 3 tracks, it's Russian roulette again. When Graham Hill, Jackie Stewart and the others arrived, it had just started raining. By the time the practice session rolled around, visibility was less than 100 yards. It then became 50 yards, and then 10 yards, to the point where the drivers were thinking, well, what's the point, shall we just go to Hockenheim? It meant that the race organisers had to add sessions to the Sunday morning, but some of the drivers were able to do laps on the Saturday before the weather became too bad. Basically, the fog rolled in. The clouds were so low, they classed it as fog. And Jackie Stewart didn't run at all in these practice sessions. But the conditions weren't much better on the Sunday morning as several drivers slid off, and Jackie Oliver had been involved in a crash at Adenau that had really rattled Stewart. Now Stewart was doing everything he could to get out of this race. He was driving not fully recovered from a broken arm. he was really apprehensive. He never drove one more lap of the Nürburgring than he had to, and it was him who nicknamed it the Green Hell. He'd been to more funerals that year than F1 Grand Prix, and when drivers died, the race continued. They had driven past Schlesser's burning Honda at Rouen while Schlesser was still being cremated inside it. His best friend had already been killed in similar conditions, and he admitted in a speech at the Oxford Union he would often look at his house as he left for the Nürburgring because he wondered if it would be the last time he'd see it, his wife, or his sons. Stewart had been involved in a row with his team boss Ken Tyrrell, and raced because Ken was his employer and told him to. Jackie even said in the Killer Years documentary that the only reason they raced sometimes was because of the commercial aspect, and this was the first year of unrestricted sponsors too. He had to race, and it was the only time Ken Tyrrell ever said to anybody, "You are racing, that's an order." And Stewart was starting 6th for this race, while Jackie Ickx has got the pole by nearly 11 seconds from Chris Amon. Circuit length tax as well as the varied conditions. But Ickx messed up the start, and it was Graham Hill that took the initial lead, with Chris Amon in 2nd, Jochemrindt in 3rd, and Stewart up to 4th. But by the halfway point of that first lap, Stewart was into 2nd. By the time they finished the lap, Stewart was in the lead, and that lead was 9 seconds. There was also a difference in the type of cars on the grid as well. Lotus and Ferrari were experimenting with wings to produce downforce. Lotus ran theirs high up and Ferrari low and in the middle of the car. BRM were running without the wings because the designers at the factory in Bourne in Lincolnshire were not convinced they actually worked, and Stewart's car had the struts installed but no actual rear wing on show. Dan Gurney was running a full face helmet for this race, being the first ever person in Formula 1 to do so. The Matra driven by Stewart was also using a different type of wet tyre to the Lotus. The Lotus was running Firestones while the Matra was on Dunlops, and the Dunlop wet tyre was working much better in these conditions compared to the Firestones, which allowed Stewart to pull away as the weather, once again, got worse. Stewart's lead was so big at the end of that one lap there were apparently audible gasps from the crowd when the announcer at the track read out the timing differences. By the end of the second lap, Stewart had pulled another 20 seconds on the car behind him. Chris Amon was behind Graham giving him the hurry up, but his car was barely visible in the spray and fog, and Chris Amon was a man who hated wet weather running. Everyone else was having code brown moments, Ickx being one of them, but Jackie kept it on the track and was making it look like he turned all the AI sliders down to 0. He led from Hill, Amon, Rindt, Ickx and Brabham, and while they didn't think the rain would intensify, it still got even worse. Everyone was tiptoeing around the track just to stay alive, and Stewart was still pulling away at a rate of knots. By the end of lap 4, that gap was up to 1 minute. In Motorsport magazine's write-up of the event, it said that the conditions were so bad that when Hill spun his car on lap 12, he thought he was going to get hit by Amon's Ferrari, but was surprised when he wasn't hit by any of the other cars whatsoever. This being that Amon had dropped off on the previous lap and Hill hadn't even seen it in his mirrors because of the spray. Hill had so much time he was able to get out of the car, push it round by hand, and then get it started again, and still remained in 2nd place. Stewart completed the 14 laps of the Green Hell 4 minutes ahead of Graham Hill, but none of that mattered. His first words out of the car were, "Did anybody die?" or words to that effect. He was more concerned over everybody making it back to the paddock alive over putting in one of, if not the greatest wet weather drive in history. Doing this with a broken arm, a sticking throttle, and oil pressure issues. Graham Hill would win the title in the year his and Jackie's friend Clark was killed, and with Stewart's performance at the Nürburgring, it was a drive worthy of a future triple world champion. So then, a look at the absolutely insane 1968 German Grand Prix. If you've learned something new here today, then do give the video a like, and for more stuff like this, do get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything I do here. Lastly, thanks to the kind folk at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help me buy up historic images for these videos, you can help out by following the link in the description, where there's also a link to Discord and socials, or there's super thanks down there if you want to top up my coffee cup. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.